It started with a knock at the door, a sharp, deliberate rap that seemed out of place on a quiet Wednesday night. I wasn't expecting anyone, but who really expects bad news to show up on their doorstep? Vanessa was in the shower, and the kids were asleep, their laughter from earlier in the evening still lingering in the house. I hesitated for a second, a strange, foreboding feeling crawling up my spine. When I opened the door, there stood a man I didn't recognize. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a worn face that looked like it had endured more storms than sunshine. He wore a tattered leather jacket, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had come to deliver something they'd rather not say. "James, right?" His voice was gravelly, and he shifted his weight like he was fighting the urge to turn around and leave. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to do this. You don't know me, but I thought you should know." His words came slow, deliberate, like he was trying to hold back a dam ready to burst. "Your wife, Vanessa. I saw her with another man last week." The world around me seemed to tilt, the kind of vertigo you get when you miss a step on a staircase. "What the hell are you talking about?" I snapped, louder than I intended. "I'm sorry," he repeated, almost flinching at my tone. "I work as a valet at the Madison. It's not my business, but," he trailed off, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a folded napkin. "She dropped this when she was leaving. It's got her name on it." I snatched it from his hand and unfolded it. Written in Vanessa's unmistakable handwriting was a room number 215 and a time, 8 p.m. The Madison was an upscale hotel downtown, the kind of place you booked for anniversaries or clandestine meetings. My chest tightened as I stared at the napkin, the ink slightly smudged, as if someone had handled it with sweaty hands. I looked back at him, my mind racing between disbelief and anger. "Why are you telling me this? What do you get out of this?" He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Look, man. I've seen this kind of thing before. It eats people alive. I figured you deserved to know. Do with it what you want." And just like that, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the gravel of our driveway. I stood there for a moment, clutching the napkin as if it were a live wire. 100 thoughts battled for dominance in my head, but one stood out. Was this real? Could Vanessa, my Vanessa, really be capable of this? I closed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. From upstairs, I heard the water shut off and Vanessa humming a tune she always sang when she was in a good mood. My stomach churned as I shoved the napkin into my pocket and braced myself for what felt like the beginning of the end. The life I thought I knew was already unraveling, and I hadn't even begun to pull the threads. I couldn't sleep that night. After the stranger's visit, everything about Vanessa felt suspect. Every interaction, every laugh, every kiss from her replayed in my head as I tried to piece together the truth. By the time the sun came up, I still hadn't decided whether to confront her directly or dig deeper. The morning was uneventful in the way you'd expect in a household where one person was holding a secret like a ticking bomb. Vanessa hummed along to a playlist while she packed the kids' lunches. I caught myself staring at her as she moved around the kitchen, trying to decide if I was looking at the woman I married or someone else entirely. It felt absurd, this game of observation, looking for signs of guilt where there might be none. Or maybe there were. The napkin from the Madison burned a hole in my pocket the entire day. I kept pulling it out when I was alone, staring at her handwriting, at the room number. I considered calling the hotel, but what would I say? "Hi, did you happen to see my wife there last week, and was she with another man?" I'd sound insane. Finally, I decided on a different approach. Vanessa had always been fiercely independent, and one of her quirks was managing her own schedule in her personal planner, an old-school, leather-bound notebook she swore by. It was her Bible for everything: work meetings, doctor appointments, even little notes to herself about errands she needed to run. She carried it everywhere, and on rare occasions, she left it at home. I got my chance that evening. Vanessa announced she had a yoga class, one of her twice-weekly escapes. The moment she walked out the door, I bolted upstairs to our bedroom, heading straight for her dresser. She had a habit of slipping her planner under a stack of magazines in the top drawer, and sure enough, it was there. Opening that notebook felt like a violation, but at this point, I needed to know. I flipped through the pages quickly, scanning for anything that stood out. Most of it was mundane work deadlines, school events, a dinner date with her best friend, Anna, from 2 weeks ago. But when I got to last Thursday, my stomach dropped. There it was, written in her neat, deliberate handwriting, 8 p.m., Madison Hotel, 2:15. I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just a coincidence. She had written it down, planned it, and made it part of her schedule. My hand shook as I flipped through the rest of the planner. Over the past few months, there were other cryptic entries: lunch meeting, 12 p.m. or client dinner, late night. At first glance, they seemed innocent, but now they felt like something else entirely. I took out my phone and snapped pictures of every suspicious entry, documenting everything. The planner went back under the magazines exactly as I found it, and I sat on the edge of our bed, trying to figure out what to do next. The evidence was damning, but I still didn't know the full story. Who was she meeting? How long had this been going on? I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed proof that she couldn't deny. Something definitive. The next day, I told my boss I had a family emergency and took the day off. It wasn't entirely a lie. I drove downtown to the Madison, parking in a spot where I could see the front entrance. I didn't have a plan yet, but I figured if I hung around long enough, maybe I could talk to the valet who had visited me. Maybe he could tell me more. I didn't have to wait long. After about an hour, I saw him, same leather jacket, same wary look in his eyes as he stood by the valet stand. I approached him cautiously, not sure how he'd react. "Hey," I said. "You came to my house the other night." He looked at me, startled, before recognition dawned. "Oh. Yeah. Look, man, Just tell me what you know," I interrupted. "Was it just the napkin, or did you see something else?" He sighed and looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Look, I've been working there a long time. People don't come to the Madison for the happy hour, you know?" I didn't want to get involved, but when she dropped that napkin, I don't know. I guess I felt bad for you. What did you see?" I pressed. "She was with a guy," he said finally. "Tall, dark hair, maybe mid-30s. They walked in together, laughing. I didn't think much of it until I parked their car and found her name on that napkin. That's all I've got, man." It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a fire in my chest. I thanked him and left, determined to get answers. That evening, Vanessa was her usual cheerful self, asking about my day and making small talk over dinner. I played along, even as my mind raced with what I'd learned. After the kids were in bed, I told her I was heading to the store and slipped out of the house. Instead, I drove to a friend's place, Mike, a tech-savvy guy who owed me a favor. Mike didn't ask too many questions when I handed him Vanessa's laptop and asked him to check it for anything unusual. "You think she's cheating?" he asked, blunt as ever. "I just need to know," I said. He nodded and got to work, digging through files, browsing history, and email accounts. I paced the room, trying to keep my emotions in check. After about an hour, he looked up at me. "You were right to be suspicious," he said grimly. He turned the laptop around, showing me an email thread between Vanessa and someone named David M. The messages were flirtatious, full of inside jokes, and plans to meet. One email stood out, a confirmation for a room booking at the Madison, dated last Thursday. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. It was real. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a coincidence. Vanessa had betrayed me. I drove home in a haze, the evidence burned into my mind. I didn't speak to her that night, barely trusting myself to stay calm. But I knew the confrontation was coming. Now I had the proof. Now I could demand the truth. I couldn't delay it any longer. Every interaction with Vanessa felt like walking across a minefield, each glance or casual word laden with the weight of what I knew. My chest felt heavy with anger and betrayal. By Friday night, the tension was unbearable. After the kids went to bed, I decided it was time. The truth had to come out, no matter how ugly it was. Vanessa was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I walked into the living room and smiled. That smile made my stomach churn. Was it guilt she was hiding behind that smile, or was she completely unbothered by what she'd done? I grabbed the remote, turned off the TV, and stood in front of her. "We need to talk," I said firmly. Her expression shifted slightly, confusion, maybe concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting her phone down. "What were you doing last Thursday night?" I asked, skipping any pretense of subtlety. Her brow furrowed, and she tilted her head. "I told you. I was at a client dinner." "Why are you asking me this?" "Don't lie to me, Vanessa." My voice was steady, but it carried an edge that surprised even me. "I know you weren't at a client dinner. You were at the Madison Hotel. Room 215. Who were you with?" Her face changed immediately. The color drained from her cheeks, and her eyes darted to the side, as if she was searching for an escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaky. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know." I pulled the photos of her planner and the email thread on my phone and shoved it in her face. "Explain this." She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like she was grasping for words. Finally, she stood up, putting her hands up in some kind of weak defense. "James, I can explain," she said quickly. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me," I demanded. "Because what I think is that my wife of 12 years is sneaking off to a hotel to meet another man." What else could this possibly mean? Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a brief moment, I thought she might tell me the truth. Instead, she went with excuses. "It was just work," she blurted. "David is a client, and the meeting ran late." "I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't tell you." "A client?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do clients book hotel rooms for meetings? Do they send flirtatious emails? Don't lie to me, Vanessa. Just admit what you did." Her tears spilled over, and she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Okay," she snapped. "I wasn't honest about everything, but it's not an affair. David and I are working on a private project for his company. The hotel was his idea because he didn't want anyone at work to know about it." "Why didn't you just tell me that up front?" I asked, refusing to back down. "Because I knew you'd react like this," she shouted back. "You're always so quick to judge and jump to conclusions." I didn't want to deal with this kind of interrogation. I stared at her, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "You're really going to stand there and lie to my face, aren't you? After everything we've built together, you don't even have the decency to be honest." She started sobbing harder, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she choked out. "I don't know how it got so complicated." "That's not an answer," I said coldly. "You've been sneaking around, lying to me, disrespecting our marriage. Tell me the truth, Vanessa. Is there someone else?" She shook her head violently, but I wasn't convinced. "No, James. I swear, there's no one else. I've been stressed with work and life, and I made some bad decisions. But I didn't cheat on you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. But the evidence was too damning, and my trust in her was already shattered. "I don't believe you," I said finally. "I can't believe you. Not after what I've seen." She sat back down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I love you, James. I do. I've been so unhappy lately, and I didn't know how to tell you." "Unhappy?" I repeated, anger surging through me. "And instead of talking to me, you run to someone else? You sneak off to hotels and lie about it?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "It's not like that. I never wanted to hurt you. I've felt lost, like something's missing, and I didn't know how to handle it." "So, what now?" I asked, my voice hollow. Am I supposed to just accept that you've been lying and pretend everything is fine? She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. I don't know, James. I don't know what to do. I just want us to be okay again. Her words did nothing to soothe the rage and betrayal boiling inside me. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the couch. I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew one thing for certain: things could never go back to the way they were. Not after this. When I stormed out of the living room that night, I didn't know where I was going. I ended up sitting in my car, staring at the darkened houses on the street, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The betrayal hit like a brick to the chest. Every memory of our marriage, every laugh, every kiss, it all felt like a lie. I didn't know who Vanessa was anymore, but one thing was clear: she wasn't the person I thought I married. I wasn't ready to make any decisions about our future. But one thing was certain: I couldn't let her get away with this. Not after the lies, the excuses, and her attempt to manipulate the situation into something about stress and being unhappy. No, Vanessa needed to feel the weight of what she had done, to understand the consequences of her actions. The next morning, after a night of restless pacing and planning, I began setting things in motion. I wasn't going to scream and throw things. I wasn't going to pack my bags and leave her crying on the doorstep. I was going to take everything she valued, her reputation, her comfort, her carefully constructed image, and let it all crumble around her. The first step was practical: securing my financial position. Vanessa and I shared joint accounts, but I knew how messy divorces could get. Before she had a chance to react, I moved half the money from our accounts into a new account in my name alone. It wasn't theft, it was my money, too, and I wasn't going to let her use it to fund her deceit. Next, I called a lawyer, a tough-as-nails divorce attorney who came highly recommended by a co-worker. When I laid out the situation, complete with the evidence I had gathered, she didn't mince words. Don't confront her anymore, the lawyer said. Keep gathering evidence. Start documenting everything. You're in a good position to protect yourself, but the more proof we have, the better. Vanessa thought she was the smart one, hiding her tracks with vague excuses and emotional deflections. But she didn't realize how much I had on her already, or how far I was willing to go to expose the truth. Over the next week, I became methodical. I told Vanessa that I needed space to think, and she seemed relieved. She took my silence as a sign that I was calming down, that her crocodile tears and half-truths had bought her time. She had no idea what was coming. I hired a private investigator. It wasn't cheap, but I wanted confirmation of everything I suspected. Within days, the PI uncovered more than I expected. Vanessa hadn't just met David once at the Madison, there were other meetings, other hotels. The emails I'd found were only the tip of the iceberg. They weren't working on any private project as she claimed. It was a full-blown affair. The PI also dug into David's background. He wasn't just some random client. He was married, too, with 2 young kids. That little detail opened a whole new set of possibilities for me. The next step was public exposure. I wasn't content with quietly filing for divorce and letting Vanessa go on pretending she was the victim. I wanted her lies to unravel in front of everyone she cared about. I gathered all the evidence: emails, hotel records, photos from the investigator. Then, I planned a family dinner. Vanessa's parents had always adored her, painting her as the perfect daughter. Her mother was the type who bragged to anyone who would listen about Vanessa's accomplishments, her happy marriage, and her wonderful husband. This dinner would shatter that illusion. I invited her parents over for what Vanessa assumed was a reconciliation dinner. I even cooked her favorite meal, playing the part of the devoted husband trying to mend the marriage. Vanessa seemed cautiously optimistic, wearing a hopeful smile as she set the table. When her parents arrived, I played along at first, pouring wine and making small talk. Vanessa visibly relaxed, thinking the worst was behind us. When dinner was served, and everyone was seated, I cleared my throat and spoke. There's something I need to share with all of you, I began, keeping my tone calm and measured. It's about Vanessa and our marriage. Vanessa froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. James, she said warningly, but I ignored her. I pulled out a folder containing the evidence and placed it on the table. For the past few months, Vanessa has been having an affair with a man named David. I have proof, emails, photos, and records of their hotel meetings. I thought you all deserved to know the truth. Her parents stared at me, stunned. Vanessa's mother looked at her, then back at me. Is this true? She demanded. Vanessa's face turned red, her composure crumbling. It's not what it looks like, she stammered. James, how could you do this in front of my parents? How could you do this to me? I shot back. You've been lying to all of us, pretending to be the perfect wife and daughter while sneaking around behind my back. Her father shook his head in disgust, pushing his chair back from the table. I can't believe this, Vanessa. After everything James has done for you. Her mother began to cry, muttering something about how she didn't raise her daughter to be this way. Vanessa tried to defend herself, but every excuse she made only dug her deeper into the hole. I let her squirm, savoring the moment as her carefully constructed image shattered. The final blow came a week later. Using the information from the PI, I contacted David's wife. She deserved to know the truth, just as I had. I sent her everything I had: emails, photos, dates, and times. Her response was immediate and furious. Within days, she had filed for divorce and kicked David out of their home. Vanessa found out about this when David called her in a panic. She confronted me, screaming about how I had no right to interfere in his marriage. No right? I shot back. You didn't care about my marriage. Why should I care about his? Her fury quickly turned to despair as the consequences of her actions closed in on her. She lost her parents' support, her lover, and the life she had taken for granted. And I wasn't done yet. I filed for divorce, citing adultery and demanding full custody of the kids. The lawyer assured me that with the evidence I had, I was in a strong position to protect my rights and ensure Vanessa paid for her betrayal, not just emotionally, but financially. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Vanessa had made her choices, and now she would have to live with the fallout. After serving Vanessa with the divorce papers, things turned icy in the house. She tried to put on a brave face for the kids, but the tension was unbearable. Every shared glance was a reminder of what she'd done and what was coming. I kept my interactions with her short and clinical. There was nothing left to say, at least, not yet. I didn't tell the kids much at first. They were too young to understand the complexity of what had happened, and I wasn't about to let them get caught in the crossfire. Mom and I are going through some things, I told them one night when Vanessa was out. But we both love you, and nothing will change that. That was a lie, of course. Everything was going to change. The house, our routines, even the holidays. Vanessa had shattered the life we'd built together, and there was no putting it back together. It was about a week after serving her the papers when she cornered me in the kitchen late one evening. The kids were asleep, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She was wearing the same hoodie and sweatpants she'd been in all week, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked exhausted, defeated. James, she began softly, her voice trembling. Can we talk? I didn't answer immediately. I was sitting at the table, going over some paperwork for the lawyer. Without looking up, I said, "What's left to talk about?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. I need to understand why you're doing this. Why you're so determined to destroy everything. That made me look up. I stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity of the statement. You think I'm destroying everything? I said, my voice calm but sharp. You destroyed this marriage the second you decided to cheat. I'm just cleaning up the mess you made. She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. She had no right to play the victim, not after everything she'd done. I made a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. I know that. But it doesn't mean we have to throw everything away. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. I laughed, the sound bitter and cold. Counseling? Fix this? Vanessa, this isn't a bad habit or a minor misstep. You betrayed me. You lied to me, over and over. How do you fix something like that? I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, tears streaming down her face now. I don't know how I let it get so far. I was lonely, James. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible. Her words hit a nerve, but I refused to let her guilt trip me. So, because you felt lonely, you decided to blow up our family? That's your excuse? It's not an excuse, she insisted. It's the truth. I should have talked to you, but I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't listen, scared that you'd think I was just complaining. You were complaining, I shot back. And instead of addressing it like an adult, you ran to someone else. You didn't just hurt me, Vanessa, you hurt the kids, our families, everything we've built. And for what? Some thrill? Some guy who didn't even respect you enough to keep things discreet? She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, as if realizing there was no defense for what she'd done. She sat down at the table, her head in her hands. I never wanted it to end like this, she whispered. Neither did I said. But you made that choice, not me. Now we're here, and there's no going back. For a moment, the room was silent except for her quiet sobs. Then she looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. What do you want from me, James? Do you want me to beg? Do you want me to hate myself? Because I already do. I don't want anything from you, I said firmly. I want you to own up to what you've done. I want you to stop pretending this is something we can fix. And I want you to sign the divorce papers so we can move on. Move on, she repeated bitterly. Is that what you're doing? Moving on? Is there someone else? Her accusation hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't believe she'd dared to ask it. You don't get to ask that, I said coldly. You lost that right the moment you walked into that hotel. She slumped back in her chair, defeated. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to let go. That's not my problem anymore, I said, standing up. You'll figure it out. The conversation left me feeling hollow. I'd thought confronting her would bring some kind of closure, but it didn't. All it did was remind me of how much I'd lost. The life we'd built together, the trust, the love, it was all gone, replaced by anger and regret. I went to bed that night, lying awake for hours. When I finally drifted off, it was with the realization that this was only the beginning. There were still lawyers, custody agreements, and the difficult task of explaining everything to the kids. But at least the conversation had made one thing clear: there was no saving this marriage. Vanessa and I were done, and it was time to focus on what came next. Tomorrow, I'd start making plans for my future, a future without her. The weeks following that last conversation were surreal. Every moment in the house felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Vanessa was still there, but she wasn't my wife anymore, at least, not in any way that mattered. She mostly stayed out of my way, likely out of shame or guilt. I didn't care why, as long as it gave me the space I needed to process everything and figure out my next steps. I focused on practical matters. The divorce process moved forward quickly, thanks to the airtight case my lawyer had built. Vanessa's infidelity left her little room to argue, and she signed the papers without much resistance. We agreed on joint custody of the kids, though I made sure to secure primary residency with me. She didn't put up a fight. Maybe she knew she didn't deserve more, or maybe she simply didn't have the energy to argue. Either way, I was relieved. I needed to protect my children from any more instability than they'd already endured. The hardest part was explaining the situation to the kids. I'd been dreading it since the moment I found out about the affair. Vanessa and I sat them down together one Sunday afternoon, and for once, we were on the same page. We'd agreed to keep the details vague. There was no need for them to know about the affair, but to be clear about the fact that their parents were no longer going to be together. I know this is a lot to take in, I told them, keeping my tone steady for their sake. But I want you to know that this doesn't change how much we love you. Mom and I will always be here for you, no matter what. Sarah, our oldest, took the news in silence, her eyes welling up with tears but her expression unreadable. She'd always been the more stoic of the two, the one who tried to keep her emotions in check. Danny, on the other hand, burst into tears, clinging to Vanessa and asking why we couldn't just stay together. "It's not that simple, buddy," I said, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes, and those mistakes make it hard for them to live together. But this isn't your fault, and it doesn't mean we don't love you." Danny's sobs didn't let up, and Vanessa reached over to comfort him, whispering apologies I wasn't sure were meant for him or me. I glanced at Sarah, who finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "Are you going to live somewhere else?" she asked Vanessa. Vanessa hesitated, looking at me as if asking for permission to answer. I nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I'll be moving into my own place soon. But I'll still see you all the time, and you can come stay with me whenever you want." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression still unreadable. "Okay," she said, though I could tell she was anything but okay. Once the kids were in bed that night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the divorce papers on the coffee table. It felt surreal to think that the life I'd spent over a decade building was officially over. The marriage certificate that had once symbolized love and commitment was now a stack of legal documents spelling out the terms of our separation. I couldn't help but wonder what my future would look like. Would I ever trust someone again? Would I even want to? The idea of starting over felt exhausting, but staying stuck in the past wasn't an option either. I had to keep moving forward, if not for myself, then for my kids. Vanessa moved out the following week. Watching her pack up her things was strangely anticlimactic. There was no shouting, no dramatic goodbyes, just a quiet, somber process that felt more like a business transaction than the end of a marriage. She packed her clothes, her books, a few personal items, and left behind everything else. When she finally walked out the door, she paused on the porch, turning to look at me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Her apology felt hollow, like a last-ditch effort to salvage some semblance of dignity. But it didn't matter anymore. She was gone, and the house was finally mine again, mine and the kids. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I took on new projects at work, focusing on advancing my career to ensure financial stability for the kids. I started going to the gym again, not out of some need for revenge or self-pity, but because I needed something to keep my mind occupied. I even started reconnecting with old friends, something I'd neglected during the marriage. Most importantly, I focused on being the best father I could be. I made sure Sarah and Danny knew they could talk to me about anything, that they were loved and supported. I attended every school event, helped with homework, and made time for family movie nights. Slowly but surely, we found a new rhythm, one that didn't include Vanessa. Months later, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store, an old college acquaintance named Laura. We hadn't seen each other in years, but the conversation flowed easily, like no time had passed. She mentioned she was recently divorced, and we bonded over the shared experience of starting over. By the time we parted ways, she had given me her number, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope. I didn't call her right away. I wasn't ready to jump into anything new just yet. But I kept her number, tucking it away as a reminder that the future might hold possibilities I hadn't considered. Looking back on everything, I've learned more about myself in the past few months than I did in the entire 12 years of my marriage. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can survive betrayal and still come out the other side. I learned that love isn't enough to sustain a relationship if trust and respect aren't there. And I learned that sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is let go, but it's also the most necessary. Vanessa and I still see each other occasionally, exchanging polite but distant words during custody exchanges. She's living in a small apartment across town, and from what I've heard, her relationship with David ended as quickly as it began. I don't feel sorry for her, but I don't feel vindictive anymore either. She made her choices, and now she has to live with them. As for me, I'm moving forward, one day at a time. The pain isn't gone, but it's no longer the center of my life. My focus is on my kids, my career, and the life I'm building for us. And maybe, just maybe, there's room for something new on the horizon. But for now, I'm content with where I am, free, rebuilding, and finally at peace.